The antique brass key felt ice cold against my palm, heavier than something so small should ever be. I'd found it sewn into the lining of David's winter coat while taking it to the dry cleaner, a coat he claimed he'd lost months ago. The same coat he'd worn the night Amanda Foster went missing. My hands trembled as I held it up to the afternoon light streaming through our kitchen window, watching the way it caught the sun like a tiny golden dagger. Behind me, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times, each note echoing through our empty house like a countdown. David wouldn't be home for another 2 hours, which meant I had exactly 120 minutes to figure out what this key unlocked before I had to pretend I'd never found it at all. The weight of that realization settled in my chest like lead, because somewhere deep in my bones, I already knew this key would open a door I could never close again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 8 months ago, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. David had just inherited the Blackwood Estate from his great-aunt, Eleanor, a sprawling Victorian mansion on 12 acres of pristine Connecticut woodland that looked like something from a fairy tale. We'd been married 3 years, living in a cramped apartment above the bakery on Main Street, dreaming of the day we could afford a real home with a yard and maybe room for the children we'd talked about having someday. The inheritance changed everything overnight. David had always been secretive about his family, claiming most of them had died when he was young, but suddenly there was this mysterious great-aunt who'd left him everything. The estate, the antique furniture, even a considerable sum in various investment accounts that made my accountant's heart sing with possibilities. We could pay off our student loans, start that family, maybe even take the honeymoon to Italy we'd postponed 3 times. I remember the first time we drove up the winding gravel path to 847 Hollow Creek Road. The mansion emerged from the tree line like something from a Gothic novel, all weathered stone and climbing ivy, with tall windows that seemed to watch our approach. David's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white, and when I asked if he was nervous about seeing his aunt's house, he just smiled that tight smile he wore whenever he didn't want to talk about something. The house was beautiful in a haunting way. High ceilings with ornate molding, hardwood floors that creaked with history, and a grand staircase that curved up to the second floor, like something Scarlett O'Hara might have descended. But there was something about the place that made me uneasy from the start, a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Maybe it was the way the portraits of long-dead Blackwoods seemed to follow you with their eyes, or how the wind through the old windows sounded almost like whispers. David threw himself into renovating the place with an intensity that surprised me. He'd always been methodical, careful, the kind of man who read instruction manuals twice before assembling IKEA furniture. But with the estate, he became almost obsessive. He spent every weekend there, often staying late into the night, claiming he was cataloging Eleanor's belongings and planning renovations. When I offered to help, he'd always find excuses for why I should stay home, usually something about the house being too dangerous with loose floorboards or electrical issues. The first red flag should have been his insistence on handling Eleanor's estate entirely by himself. As an accountant, I offered to help with the financial paperwork, but David insisted his law firm could handle everything. He said the estate was more complicated than it looked, with trusts and legal obligations I wouldn't understand. I let it slide because David was a lawyer, after all, and estate law was technically his specialty. But it stung a little, the way he dismissed my expertise so casually. Our marriage began to change in small ways that I told myself were just the stress of such a big life change. David started working later, claiming he had more clients now that word was getting around about his inheritance. He became particular about his privacy in ways he'd never been before, password protecting his phone and laptop, keeping his home office locked even when he wasn't there. When I mentioned it, he laughed and said he was just being more careful with client confidentiality now that his practice was growing. The night terrors started about 2 months after we moved into the estate. David would wake up gasping, sometimes screaming, his body drenched in sweat and his eyes wild with something that looked like terror. When I'd try to comfort him, he'd push me away, claiming he couldn't remember what he'd been dreaming about. But I heard him sometimes, in those moments between sleep and waking, mumbling apologies to people whose names I didn't recognize. names like Jake and Amanda and someone called Maria. I tried to create normalcy in our new life. I planted a small herb garden behind the kitchen, hung cheerful curtains in the breakfast nook, and invited our friends over for dinner parties in the formal dining room. But David grew increasingly uncomfortable with having people in the house. He'd make excuses to cancel plans, or when guests did come over, he'd hover anxiously, steering conversations away from the house's history and cutting evenings short with claims of early morning meetings. My friend Rebecca was the first to voice what I'd been trying not to think. We were having coffee at the Old Mill restaurant downtown, the kind of cozy place where everyone knows everyone's business, when she leaned across the table and asked if everything was okay with David. She said he seemed different since the inheritance, more withdrawn, and that some people in town were starting to talk about the Blackwood family history. When I pressed her for details, she hesitated, then mentioned that Eleanor Blackwood had been something of a recluse, and that there had always been strange stories about that family. I should have pushed harder for those stories, but part of me didn't want to know. I was living in a beautiful house with the man I loved, finally financially secure for the first time in our marriage. Why complicate that with old gossip and small-town rumors? But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew a little larger every time David came home with dirt under his fingernails he couldn't explain. Or every time I found unfamiliar items in his pockets, small things like jewelry, or personal items that clearly belonged to women. The disappearances started in April. Jake Morrison was first, a traveling salesman who'd been staying at the Millbrook Inn while working the territory. His car was found abandoned on Route 7, but Jake himself seemed to have vanished into thin air. The police interviewed everyone in town, including David, since Jake had apparently stopped by our house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. House asking for directions the day he disappeared. David told them Jake had seemed confused, possibly intoxicated, and that he'd pointed him back toward town before sending him on his way. Amanda Foster disappeared 6 weeks later. She was a real estate agent, young and ambitious, the kind of person who knew everyone in Millbrook and was known by everyone in return. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through our small community, because Amanda wasn't the type to just vanish. She had appointments, clients, a life that couldn't just be abandoned. The last person to see her alive was her assistant, who said Amanda was driving out to show a property on Hollow Creek Road. When Detective Karen Walsh came by to ask if we'd seen Amanda, David was calm in a way that struck me as almost unnatural. He explained that Amanda had indeed stopped by, interested in discussing the potential sale of some of Eleanor's antique furniture. They'd talked briefly on the front porch, but Amanda had left when David explained he wasn't ready to sell anything yet. He mentioned that she'd seemed disappointed, maybe even upset, but that she'd driven away without incident. I wanted to believe him. More than that, I needed to believe him, because the alternative was too horrible to contemplate. But doubt crept in like water, through cracks in a foundation, slowly but persistently undermining everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married. I started paying closer attention to David's comings and goings, noting the times he left and returned, the condition of his clothes, the explanations he gave for where he'd been. The third disappearance happened just 2 weeks ago. Maria Santos, a housekeeper who worked for several families in the area, including the Garretts who lived 2 miles down Hollow Creek Road. She'd been walking home from work, a route she'd taken safely hundreds of times before, when she simply vanished. Her family was frantic, the police were baffled, and the entire town was starting to talk about a possible serial killer targeting women in our area. That night, I confronted David about the pattern I was seeing. 3 people, all last seen in our area, all disappeared without a trace. I asked him directly if he thought there might be some connection to the estate, whether Eleanor might have had enemies, or whether the isolation of our property might be attracting someone with bad intentions. David's reaction was swift and sharp. He accused me of letting small-town gossip get to my head, of being paranoid and suspicious without cause. He reminded me that we lived in a safe area, that these disappearances were probably unrelated coincidences, and that I was letting fear override common sense. But his anger felt disproportionate to my questions, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt afraid of my husband. Not physically afraid, not yet, but afraid of the stranger he seemed to be becoming. The David I'd married would have understood my concerns, would have talked through my fears with patience and logic. This David shut down conversations and dismissed my feelings in ways that left me feeling isolated and confused. I started doing small tests. Nothing dramatic, just ways to check whether David was being honest with me. I'd mention seeing his car in places where he claimed not to have been, or ask about phone calls he'd taken in private. Each time, he had explanations that were technically plausible but felt increasingly rehearsed. It was like living with someone who was always performing, never quite genuine, never fully present in our conversations. The dreams got worse. Not just David's night terrors, but my own dreams, vivid and disturbing visions of people calling for help from somewhere dark and cold. I'd wake up with the taste of earth in my mouth and the sound of muffled screaming echoing in my ears. During the day, I found myself studying David's face when he thought I wasn't looking, searching for signs of the man I'd married under this stranger who'd taken his place. Mrs. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor, stopped by one afternoon while David was at work. She brought me fresh tomatoes from her garden, and what she claimed was just friendly concern, but I could tell she had something else on her mind. After we'd exchanged pleasantries and she'd admired my herb garden, she mentioned that she'd been having trouble sleeping lately because of strange sounds coming from our direction at night. Digging sounds, she said, like someone was working in the garden with heavy tools. When I asked David about it that evening, he explained that he'd been doing some landscaping work in the evenings when it was cooler, trying to clear some overgrown areas near the tree line. He showed me his hands, which did indeed have calluses and small cuts consistent with outdoor work. But when I asked to see what he'd been working on, he said it wasn't ready yet, that he wanted to surprise me with a proper garden area once it was finished. The key changed everything. Finding it hidden in the lining of his coat, the coat he'd sworn was lost, made all my small doubts crystallize into terrible certainty. This wasn't paranoia or small-town gossip poisoning my mind. This was evidence of deception, proof that David had been lying to me about things both small and potentially enormous. Standing in our kitchen with that cold brass key in my hand, I realized I was at a crossroads that would define the rest of my life. I could put the key back, pretend I'd never found it, and continue living in the beautiful house with the man I'd married, accepting that some questions were better left unasked. Or I could find out what the key unlocked and face whatever truth was waiting for me, no matter how terrible it might be. The grandfather clock chimed again, 4:30 now, and David's voice echoed in my memory from that morning, when he'd kissed me goodbye and said he'd be home by 6 with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. 90 minutes to make a choice that couldn't be unmade. 90 minutes to decide whether I was brave enough to discover what my husband had been hiding from me. I closed my fingers around the key and walked toward the basement door. The basement stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the darkness below like a warning I should have heeded. The air grew colder as I descended, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and wrong that made my stomach clench with dread. At the bottom, I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling against the rough stone wall until finally finding the familiar plastic rectangle. The single bulb cast harsh shadows across the basement, revealing Eleanor's old furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts frozen in time. But it wasn't the antique armoire or the boxes of family china that drew my attention. It was the door I'd never noticed before, tucked behind the massive oak bookshelf that David claimed was too heavy to move. The door was painted the same gray as the basement walls, camouflaged deliberately, and in its center was a brass keyhole that perfectly matched the key burning in my palm. My rational mind screamed at me to turn around, to climb those stairs and pretend I'd never found the key, never seen this hidden door. But my body moved forward as if controlled by someone else, my hand extending the key toward the lock with mechanical precision. The key slid in perfectly, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire house above me. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a narrow stone corridor that disappeared into absolute darkness. The smell hit me like a physical blow, the unmistakable stench of death and decay mixed with chemicals that burned my nostrils and throat. I gagged, pressing my hand to my mouth, but something deeper than fear compelled me forward. I needed to know. After months of doubt and suspicion, After lying awake at night wondering if I was losing my mind, I finally had proof that David had been hiding something from me. The corridor was longer than seemed possible, extending far beyond what should have been the foundation of our house. My phone's flashlight created a weak circle of illumination that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness ahead. The walls were rough stone, old enough to predate the main house, with iron brackets that might once have held torches. Eleanor's family had clearly built more than just a Victorian mansion. They'd built a place for secrets. The corridor ended at another door, this one heavy wood, reinforced with iron bands. It stood slightly ajar, and through the gap came a soft, mechanical humming that raised every hair on my body. I pushed the door open and stepped into a room that defied everything I thought I knew about the world. The space was enormous, carved from living rock and lit by modern LED strips that cast everything in harsh white light. Along the walls were what looked like museum display cases, each one carefully labeled and climate-controlled. But these weren't displaying art or historical artifacts. They were displaying people. Jake Morrison stood in the first case, perfectly preserved, his traveling salesman's smile frozen on his face for eternity. The placard beneath read, April 15, 2024. First successful preservation using Eleanor's enhanced formula. My legs nearly gave out as I recognized his features from the missing person posters that had papered Millbrook for weeks. Amanda Foster was in the next case, her real estate blazer immaculate, her blonde hair styled as if she were still showing houses to potential buyers. May 30, 2024. Excellent results with younger female specimen. Formula requires minor adjustment for optimal tissue preservation. Maria Santos stood in the third case, her housekeeper's uniform clean and pressed, her kind face peaceful in death. October 8, 2024. Perfect preservation achieved. Eleanor would be proud of the progress. I stumbled backward, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. These weren't just bodies. They were trophies, carefully maintained and displayed like insects in an entomologist's collection. Each case had detailed notes about preservation techniques, chemical formulas, and what David clinically referred to as specimen quality. But it was the fourth case that sent me to my knees, retching onto the stone floor. It was empty, but it wasn't waiting for a random victim. The placard read, Sarah Mitchell, beloved wife, reserved for final collection. My vision blurred with tears and terror as the full scope of David's deception crashed over me. The inheritance, the mysterious great-aunt, the late nights at the estate, the personality changes. It hadn't been stress or adjustment to new wealth. It had been David embracing something monstrous that had been waiting in this underground chamber, something Eleanor had left behind along with her fortune. I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me, slow and deliberate, the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. David's voice echoed off the stone walls, calm and conversational as if he were commenting on the weather. I was wondering when you'd find Eleanor's workshop. She always said the curious ones were the most interesting specimens. I spun around to find David standing in the doorway, no longer the man I'd married but someone wearing his face like a mask. His lawyer's suit was impeccable as always, but his eyes held something I'd never seen before, a cold satisfaction that made my blood freeze in my veins. You don't understand what you're seeing, Sarah. This isn't what you think it is. You're a murderer. The words came out as a whisper, all the air seemingly sucked from my lungs. David stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Eleanor called it preservation. She believed that some people were too beautiful, too perfect, to be allowed to decay in the ground like common corpses. She spent decades perfecting the process, creating a way to keep the essence of a person intact forever. He moved toward the display cases with the reverence of a curator giving a private tour. Jake was practice. I'll admit, I was rusty with Eleanor's techniques at first. But Amanda, she was perfect. Young, healthy, exactly the type of specimen Eleanor would have chosen. And Maria, she achieved true artistic preservation. Look at her, Sarah. Look how peaceful she is. They're dead, David. You killed them. I transformed them. There's a difference. He turned back to me, and I saw madness glittering in his eyes like broken glass. Eleanor left me everything. not just her money and property. She left me her calling, her purpose. For 60 years, she collected the most beautiful people she could find, preserving them for eternity. When she died, the collection needed a new curator. I backed away from him, my hand fumbling for my phone, desperate to call for help. But David moved faster than I expected, his hand closing around my wrist with crushing force. "You won't be needing that. No one comes to Hollow Creek Road without an invitation, and Mrs. Rodriguez won't be concerned if she doesn't see you for a few days. I've already told the bank you're taking time off to deal with a family emergency." The casual way he spoke about my disappearance, the planning he'd already put in motion, made me realize this wasn't a spontaneous decision. This had been inevitable from the moment I found that key. Maybe even from the moment we'd inherited this house. "Why me, David? Why your own wife?" His grip loosened slightly, and for a moment I saw something that might have been grief cross his features. "Because you're perfect, Sarah. You're young, beautiful, intelligent. You represent the best of what humanity can be." Eleanor always said that preservation was an act of love, a way of keeping perfection safe from the corruption of time. That's insane. That's not love, that's possession. Is it so different from marriage? You promise to be mine until death do us part. I'm simply ensuring that death won't part us. The matter-of-fact way he spoke about murdering me, as if it were just another legal contract to be executed, snapped something inside me. The fear that had paralyzed me transformed into rage, and I drove my knee upward with every ounce of strength I possessed. David doubled over with a grunt of pain, his grip on my wrist loosening just enough for me to tear free. I ran for the door, my feet slipping on the smooth stone floor, expecting any second to feel his hands grab me from behind. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead of me, my phone's light bouncing wildly as I sprinted toward what I hoped was freedom. Behind me, I could hear David recovering, his footsteps echoing in pursuit. But I had a head start, and terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I burst through the basement door and up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, my lungs burning with the effort. The main floor of the house looked surreal after the horror below, all warm wood and elegant furniture, as if the nightmare in the basement existed in a different reality. I ran for the front door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. When it finally clicked open, I burst out into the October afternoon, the normal world of blue sky and falling leaves so bright it hurt my eyes. My car keys were in my purse, which was sitting on the kitchen counter. There was no time to go back for them. I ran down the gravel driveway toward Hollow Creek Road, my heels skidding on the loose stones, praying that a car would come by, that someone would see me and stop to help. The sound of the front door slamming behind me sent fresh terror through my system. David was following, and on foot, I'd never make it to the main road before he caught up. The woods on either side of the driveway were thick with underbrush, but they offered the only chance of hiding until I could figure out what to do. I plunged into the tree line, branches tearing at my clothes and skin as I pushed deeper into the forest. Behind me, I could hear David calling my name, his voice eerily calm despite the circumstances. "Sarah, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Come back to the house and we'll discuss this rationally. You're upset, you're not thinking clearly." Even now, even after everything I'd seen, he was trying to gaslight me, to make me doubt my own sanity. But I'd seen those bodies, those preserved corpses displayed like art pieces. I'd seen my own name on that empty case, waiting for my inevitable murder. The forest was dense enough that I quickly lost sight of the house, but I could still hear David moving through the underbrush, methodically searching for me. I needed to get to a phone, needed to call Detective Walsh and tell her what I'd discovered. But first, I needed to survive long enough to make that call. I found a fallen log to hide behind, pressing myself against the damp earth and trying to control my breathing. Through the trees, I could see David moving in a grid pattern, searching with the patience of someone who knew I had nowhere to go. He'd changed out of his suit into dark clothes better suited for hiking, and he carried something in his right hand that glinted metallic in the filtered sunlight. A syringe. He wasn't planning to strangle me or beat me to death. He was going to drug me, probably with whatever chemicals he'd used on the others, then carry me back to that underground chamber to begin the preservation process while I was still alive. The thought made my stomach revolt, but it also crystallized my determination. I wouldn't end up in one of those cases, another specimen in Eleanor's grotesque collection. I had to get out of these woods, had to reach civilization in safety. I waited until David moved past my hiding spot, then began crawling through the underbrush in what I hoped was the direction of the main road. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves that rustled with every movement, but David seemed focused on searching the areas where someone running in panic might logically hide. It took me 20 minutes of careful movement to reach the edge of the woods. Through the trees, I could see Hollow Creek Road stretching in both directions, empty of traffic but representing salvation if I could reach it safely. Between me and the road was about 50 yards of open ground, a lawn that belonged to the Garrett house. I could see lights on in the Garrett's windows, could imagine Thomas inside, reading his evening paper, while his wife prepared dinner. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that a serial killer lived just down the road from them. If I could reach their door, if I could convince them to call the police, I might survive this nightmare. I waited until David's voice sounded distant, coming from deeper in the woods, then made my break for the open ground. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, my feet flying over the grass, expecting any second to hear David crashing through the trees behind me. The Garrett's front porch had never looked so beautiful as it did when I reached their door. I pounded on the wood with both fists, not caring how desperate I sounded, only caring that someone answer before David realized where I'd gone. Thomas Garrett opened the door with a confused smile that immediately shifted to concern when he saw my appearance. I was covered in dirt and scratches, my clothes torn from the branches, my face streaked with tears and terror. "Sarah, what happened to you? Are you hurt?" "Call the police," I gasped, pushing past him into the safety of his house. "Call Detective Walsh. Tell her it's about the missing people. Tell her David killed them." Thomas's wife Helen appeared from the kitchen, her face going pale as she took in my condition. "Oh my God, what happened?" "David's been killing people. Jake Morrison, Amanda Foster, Maria Santos. He has their bodies in a room under our house. He was going to kill me too." I saw the moment Thomas decided to believe me, his face hardening with resolve as he reached for his phone. But before he could dial, the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness, and through the windows came the sound of David's voice, calm and reasonable as always. "Thomas, Helen, I'm sorry about this, but my wife is having a mental health crisis. She's been under a lot of stress since we inherited the estate, and tonight she's become delusional and dangerous. I need to get her to a hospital where she can receive proper care." "Don't listen to him," I whispered frantically. "He cut your power. He's trying to trap us all." But I could see doubt creeping into Thomas's eyes. David sounded so rational, so concerned. And I looked like exactly what David was claiming, a woman who'd had a complete mental breakdown. My word against his, and he was a respected lawyer while I was a hysterical woman covered in dirt. Helen moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "David, is that you?" Sarah burst in here claiming you'd hurt people. "I know, Helen, she's very sick. I've been trying to get her help, but she ran away from the house before I could call her doctor. If you could just keep her calm while I call for an ambulance, I'd be very grateful." I watched the last of my hope crumble as Thomas moved toward me with the cautious approach one uses with dangerous animals. He believed David, just like everyone in Millbrook would believe David. The successful lawyer against the unstable wife. There would be no rescue, no salvation from helpful neighbors. "Don't touch me," I warned, backing toward the kitchen. "Thomas, please, you have to listen to me. Check the basement of our house. You'll find the bodies. You'll see I'm telling the truth." "Sarah, you need help," Thomas said gently. "Let us call someone who can help you feel better." Through the kitchen window, I saw David moving around the side of the house, no longer bothering to hide. He knew he had me trapped, knew that even if I escaped the Garrett house, I was still miles from town with no car and no one who would believe my story. But I also saw something else. Mrs. Rodriguez's house across the road, where our elderly neighbor had complained about hearing digging sounds at night. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd lived in Millbrook her entire life, who knew the stories about the Blackwood family that no one else would tell me. I ran for the back door of the Garrett house, ignoring Thomas calling after me. If I could reach Mrs. Rodriguez, if I could convince one person to believe me, I might still have a chance. The backyard was dark, but I knew the layout from countless neighborhood barbecues. I ran across the grass toward the road, praying that David hadn't anticipated this move. Mrs. Rodriguez's porch light was on, a beacon in the darkness that gave me hope. I pounded on her door with desperate intensity, looking over my shoulder for any sign of David pursuing me. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Rodriguez in her housecoat, her gray hair in curlers, but her dark eyes sharp and alert despite the late hour. "Sarah? Child, what's wrong? Mrs. Rodriguez, you have to help me. David killed those missing people. He has their bodies hidden in our basement. He's trying to kill me too." I expected doubt. Expected the same rational skepticism Thomas had shown. Instead, Mrs. Rodriguez's face went grim with what looked almost like resignation. I knew this day would come. I hoped when Eleanor died that the madness would die with her. But I should have known better. The Blackwood curse doesn't die easy. She pulled me inside her house, quickly locking the door behind us. "How much do you know about Eleanor's activities, child?" David said she preserved people, that she collected them. But I thought he was just insane. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head sadly. Eleanor Blackwood disappeared people for 60 years. Young folks passing through town, runaways, anyone who wouldn't be missed right away. The police could never prove anything. But those of us who'd lived here long enough, we knew. We just never had evidence. Why didn't anyone stop her? How do you stop someone with unlimited money and political connections? Eleanor owned half the town, employed the other half. And she was careful, very careful. Never took locals if she could help it. Never took anyone who'd be missed by important people. Mrs. Rodriguez moved to her kitchen window, peering out toward my house through the darkness. When she died and left everything to David, I thought maybe it was over. But then people started disappearing again, and I heard those digging sounds at night. I should have called the police then, but I'm an old woman and David's a lawyer. Who would believe me? You believe me now? Child, I've been waiting 70 years for someone to have proof of what that family has been doing. If you've seen the bodies, if you have evidence, then we can finally end this. She handed me her cordless phone with steady hands. Call Detective Walsh. Tell her everything. I'll call the FBI. Whatever's hidden in that house, we're going to drag it into the light. But as I started to dial, the lights in Mrs. Rodriguez's house went out too. Through the windows came David's voice again, closer now, right outside the front door. "Sarah, I know you're in there. Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm sorry you got involved in this, but I can't let you interfere with family business." Mrs. Rodriguez moved with surprising speed for her age, grabbing a shotgun from the closet by her front door. "I've been ready for this conversation for decades, you sick bastard. Mrs. Rodriguez, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sarah is mentally ill. She needs medical treatment, not enablement in her delusions. The only delusion here is thinking your family's money would protect you forever." The front door exploded inward, David's foot connecting with the wood just below the lock. But instead of the calm, rational lawyer, the man who entered was something feral and desperate. His clothes were torn from chasing me through the woods, his face streaked with dirt and scratched by branches. Worst of all, his eyes held no trace of the man I'd married. They were the eyes of a predator finally cornered. Mrs. Rodriguez raised the shotgun with hands that didn't shake. "Stay back, David. I've called the FBI. They're on their way." "You foolish old woman. Do you have any idea what you're interfering with?" Eleanor's work was art, preservation of beauty that would otherwise rot in the ground. Sarah belongs in the collection. She was always meant to be part of the collection. The only thing you've collected is a lifetime in prison. David lunged forward faster than I expected, his hand closing around the barrel of the shotgun before Mrs. Rodriguez could fire. They struggled for control of the weapon, David's youth and strength overwhelming the elderly woman's determination. I had seconds to act before David gained control of the gun. My eyes fell on Mrs. Rodriguez's kitchen knife block, the wooden handles gleaming in the dim light from the street. I grabbed the largest blade and moved behind David while he was focused on wrestling the shotgun away from Mrs. Rodriguez. I'd never hurt another human being in my life, had never even been in a physical fight. But as I raised that knife, I wasn't thinking about David as a human being. I was thinking about Jake Morrison's preserved smile, Amanda Foster's frozen expression, Maria Santos standing eternally at attention in her housekeeper's uniform. I was thinking about the empty case with my name on it, waiting for David to complete his collection. The knife went into David's back just below his shoulder blade, sliding between ribs with less resistance than I'd expected. He screamed, a sound of pure animal rage and pain, releasing the shotgun to reach back toward the wound. Mrs. Rodriguez staggered backward, raising the weapon with shaking hands. "Get away from him, Sarah. Get behind me." But David spun around, his face contorted with fury, blood spreading across his shirt. "You stupid bitch. You've ruined everything. 60 years of Eleanor's work, decades of perfect preservation, and you've destroyed it all." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the syringe I'd seen him carrying in the woods. Whatever was in it glowed faintly in the dim light, some chemical cocktail designed to paralyze while keeping the victim conscious during the preservation process. "I'll make you watch while I prepare Mrs. Rodriguez first. You'll see exactly what you've denied yourself, what perfect preservation looks like." Mrs. Rodriguez's finger found the trigger of the shotgun, just as David lunged toward her with the syringe. The blast was deafening in the small house, the sound echoing off the walls and leaving my ears ringing. David flew backward, hitting the wall with a wet impact that spoke of massive internal damage. He slid down the wall, leaving a streak of blood on the floral wallpaper, his eyes still fixed on me with frustrated rage. "You don't understand what you've done. Eleanor's work was immortality. True immortality. You've chosen decay over perfection. I have chosen life over your sick fantasy." David's breathing grew shallow, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. But his eyes remained focused, his voice still carrying that terrifying calm. "It doesn't matter. Others know about Eleanor's work. Others who understand the beauty of preservation. They'll continue what we started. They'll find you, Sarah. They'll finish what I couldn't." Those were his last words. David Mitchell, the man I'd married, the monster I'd discovered, died on Mrs. Rodriguez's kitchen floor with Eleanor's madness still burning in his eyes. Detective Walsh arrived with the FBI 20 minutes later, their cars lighting up the quiet neighborhood with red and blue strobes. They found the underground chamber exactly as I'd described it, the preserved bodies still standing in their climate-controlled cases like exhibits in some nightmare museum. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Eleanor Blackwood's activities. Over 60 years, she'd perfected techniques for preserving human bodies that combined embalming with chemical processes that kept tissue fresh and lifelike indefinitely. Her journals, found in the underground chamber, detailed hundreds of experiments and dozens of successful specimens dating back to the 1960s. David hadn't been lying about the inheritance being more than money and property. Eleanor had left him detailed instructions for continuing her work, along with chemicals, equipment, and a list of other collectors around the country who shared her obsession with preserving human beauty. The FBI raids that followed over the coming months uncovered a network of killers and collectors that stretched across multiple states. I testified at congressional hearings about human trafficking, consulted with FBI profilers about the psychology of collectors, and became the public face of survivor advocacy. But no amount of good that came from exposing Eleanor's network could erase the memory of seeing my own name on that empty display case, or the knowledge that the man I'd loved had planned to murder me as an act of preservation. Mrs. Rodriguez became my closest friend and fiercest protector. She moved in with me after David's death, claiming her house held too many bad memories. But I knew she was really making sure I was never alone and vulnerable. Together, we turned the Blackwood Estate into a memorial for David and Eleanor's victims, a place where people could come to remember those who'd been lost and to understand the importance of questioning when something seems too good to be true. The inheritance that had seemed like such a blessing turned out to be a curse that had corrupted my husband and nearly cost me my life. But it also gave me a purpose I'd never had before. Every time I spoke to law enforcement groups about recognizing predatory behavior, every time I helped another survivor find their voice, I was transforming David and Eleanor's legacy of death into something that might save lives. I never remarried. How could I trust my judgment about men after being so completely deceived by David? But I found peace in my work, satisfaction in turning tragedy into purpose, and strength in knowing I'd survived something that should have destroyed me. The empty display case with my name on it was destroyed, along with the rest of Eleanor's collection. But I kept the brass key that had started it all. Sometimes I hold it in my palm and remember that moment in the kitchen when I had to choose between comfortable ignorance and terrible truth. I made the right choice, even though it nearly killed me. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But sometimes that's exactly what the world needs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.